Two of the biggest problems of modern times are climate change and the public health crisis due to sedentary lifestyles. Transportation is the number one contributor to greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change, and working from home increases the chance of lifestyle diseases. Active transportation could be a solution. Professor Shilpa Dogra has been doing research on active transportation using e-bikes. She is an assistant professor at University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Dogra presented her research to the Active Transportation and Sustainability Advisory Committee. The research was done in Oshawa neighborhoods but are equally applicable to Barrie. In 2019, the City of Barrie adopted the Transportation Master Plan to enhance walking and cycling infrastructure. The city has also set aggressive net zero emission goals. In 2017, the City Council passed the Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, and in 2018, it allocated $180,000 towards implementing it. The links to transportation and climate change reports are in the description below. In her research presentation titled The Future of Transportation, Professor Dogra talked about the problems with sedentary lifestyles, especially because of ongoing pandemic. Her research for the city of Oshawa, among others, showed that active living was not supported by the city, and not having physical barriers to bike lanes prevented older adults from cycling.
It sort of ties a few themes together, and I was really excited to hear that there's such a diverse group in terms of people with different interests in active transportation, but also accessibility in the environment, because I think one of the things that active transportation needs is more advocacy with different groups, because it really does hit on so many different priorities of municipalities. And so hopefully today I can give you some information that can help you sort of advocate for some more funding and resources for active transportation. My background is in exercise science, and over the last few years, most of my research has focused on sedentary behavior. So for those of you who might not know the definition, sedentary behavior is any seated or reclined activity that requires low energy expenditure. So basically what most of us are doing right now, and as most of us have experienced over the course of the last 2 years, our sedentary time has increased quite dramatically. We accumulate sedentary time in different sort of activities throughout the day. It might be during leisure activities like grabbing a coffee with a friend, occupational activities like sitting at work, household activities like sitting in front of the TV. And what's really interesting to me is that we accumulate a lot of sedentary time when we're moving around our communities and our cities during transportation. So we sit in our cars, we sit on buses, we sit on trains. And so we're accumulating a lot of sedentary time during transportation as well. And as many of you are likely aware, sedentary time is associated with lots of negative health outcomes, and is becoming a bit of a target for public health because there's so much that we can affect in terms of chronic disease prevention by reducing sedentary time. When I sort of looked at this through the lens of transportation, I thought, well, there's a real opportunity here for us to impact the health of individuals and population level health, but also to affect the health of our planet through reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So my lens for this work is to really displace sedentary transportation with active forms of transportation. And I really do feel that this will have an effect on the environment, on age-friendly approaches to our communities, and of course, impacting the health of both, our people and the planet. So with this in mind, I've been working with the City of Oshawa to do some work to understand different aspects of active transportation. A couple of years ago, when the city started their age-friendly initiative to work with the World Health Organization to be recognized as an age-friendly town, we started this work around active transportation with 2 research projects. The first was a set of focus groups with 52 older adults in the City of Oshawa. And the second piece was an online survey where we connected the survey data to postal code level data from the Canoe data set. And so this is available throughout Canada and gives you information on, intersection density, dwelling density, transit stops, and such information, as well as greenness. So this information has been published, and I'm happy to share links if people are interested in looking at the full reports. But I'm going to give a brief summary of our findings. What we found overall was that our neighborhoods were not really supporting active living. So if you take a look at this first graph here, hopefully you can see the cursor, the active living environment score for the 4 neighborhoods of the participants that were represented in our survey. I don't have the postal codes here, we anonymized that. So we had 4 neighborhoods here. And if you look at the active living score, with the best possible being a score of 5, all of our neighborhoods fell below a 3. So not surprisingly, we had older adults making comments like this: "I won't even ride my bike on the road anymore. To me, it's just too scary." When we looked at walk, bike, and transit scores for the 4 neighborhoods that were represented in the survey, we found that almost all of them were below the minimally supportive threshold of a score of 50. So again, not surprisingly, we found older adults saying things like walking is too dangerous. And that really surprised me because walking is so common in older adults. And so that the fact that some folks are thinking walking is too dangerous is really problematic. So our neighborhoods do not meet that sort of minimal threshold for active living, both using this active living environment score or these walk, bike, and transit scores. When we asked older adults what the barriers were, you can see from here there were fear of being hit by a car. There were issues related to bike lanes not being protected. And you can see in some neighborhoods, this bike lane issue was actually, a barrier listed by 100% of the older adults. And so not surprisingly, then you hear older adults say things like, "You stay home." To me, this really hit home because as an age-friendly community, we're really trying to reduce social isolation and loneliness. And this has become such a target even throughout the pandemic. And so the fact that our infrastructure and our community design is encouraging or facilitating social isolation is extremely problematic and something for us to think about more carefully.
Her team also had discussions with various groups in Oshawa to come up with solutions. The recommendations were later submitted to the city.
Once we had the results from those research projects, we actually held a think tank in the city of Oshawa with folks from a variety of different stakeholder groups. So older adults, we had students, we had researchers, we had municipal folks represented, and we took each of the barriers and tried to come up with solutions. So we had 9 different areas. I just have one represented here with regards to the cycling related barriers. We came up with solutions, and as you can see here, these are some of the solutions to the cycling related barriers that were identified. So things like increasing and improving infrastructures, keeping bike lanes clear, especially in the winter, enforcing no parking in bike lanes, speed limits, access to cycling through things like bike share programs, and creating community hubs for bike repair and bike donation. So we did this for each of the 9 sort of areas of barriers that we identified, and then created a report that was submitted to the city. This is just an example or an excerpt from the report where we talked about different areas as well. So in this case, urban design, we addressed policies and culture and things like that as well, and gave some recommendations to the city around ways in which we can create more age-friendly, barrier-free active transportation opportunities. Some of these might seem fairly common, and for those of you who've been working in the area of active transportation, are already on your radar. Some of the ones that we thought were somewhat unique were things like providing benches and rest stops for older adults, water fountains, washrooms. In one case, an older adult identified that they don't have cell phones, and so having phone booths for emergencies is actually quite important as well. So if you're walking along an isolated trail and you don't have a cell phone and there's no way to sort of communicate with anyone if you fall or if something happens, then that's problematic as well. So some opportunities to think about the design of our communities for people who are older. Once we went through this process, I started to sort of take a broader look at transportation because there were so many connections with public transportation and personal car use that came out through this work.
One of the major focuses of Dogra's work is equitable transportation to ensure barrier-free movement of people of all ages, color, income levels, and ability levels within the community. According to her, integrated transportation can help achieve that goal.
I started working with a colleague in engineering who's got an environmental clean energy background. And he's often said to me, transportation is the number one contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And I thought, well, what an opportunity we have here with active transportation being a solution both to our environmental problems, but also the significant public health issue that we have around inactivity and sedentary time. So we held a workshop in October 2019, pre-pandemic, if you can believe it, with about 100 people, including local stakeholders, elected officials from different levels of government, researchers, students, all sorts of folks were in attendance, and we had 4 different sessions: one on healthy cities, one on electrification, one on integrated transportation, and one on public transit or ride sharing. And one of the main conclusions from that day was that, of course, we need to encourage multimodal transportation, but we also need to ensure that it's equitable and barrier-free. A lot of the times we have communities or neighborhoods that are lower income and are unable to sort of access bike lanes or trails. And so we need to take a sort of equitable lens to some of this work. One of the key things that we wanted to highlight is the importance of an integrated approach to transportation. So when we think about transportation, we often think about something like the Ministry of Transportation, which of course is relevant because it is transportation. But I want you to take a moment to think about all of the different ministries or different stakeholder groups that are relevant to this conversation around integrated transportation. So for example, the Ministry of Seniors and Communities is relevant because if we want age-friendly, barrier-free environments, then they have to be involved in the conversation. The Ministry of Health is important because of the impacts on air quality and active transportation. The Ministry of Environment, of course, is relevant because of emissions and air quality. Municipal Affairs is relevant because of things like gas taxes and infrastructure. Ministry of Infrastructure could help with e-charging stations and active and public transportation. Ministry of Energy is important for the electricity grid and e-mobility. And then, of course, ministries like sport and culture are important because of the impact they can have on the uptake of cycling and trails and paths. So you really, when you start to think about transportation and active transportation being a critical component of it, you start to realize that this siloed approach that we're currently taking, unfortunately, is not getting the traction that we need for the transformation necessary to have an impact. So an integrated approach is really critical. And we put all of this together in a report that we published in the journal Sustainability. And these are some of the main sort of recommendations that we came up with. As you can see, most of the recommendations, or the first few, are related to public or active transportation. That was my sort of input there. They're all evidence-based recommendations. We've scoured the literature and found lots of support for these recommendations. So things like supporting the creation and development of accessible and safe transportation, active transportation infrastructure. And when you think about the effect of that, the increase in the number of residents who participate in active transportation and reduce their reliance on a personal vehicle, of course, that's going to have effects on health and the environment. And so as you go through each of these, you see that, of course, the number one thing that it's affecting is a reduction on reliance of a personal vehicle. And as a result, increasing physical activity levels and decreasing emissions. One of our main sort of take-homes or recommendations was, again, to work across silos to improve integrated mobility to impact climate and health-related outcomes.
Dogra has done research on how e-bikes with pedals can help achieve active transportation goals. She tried to dispel common misconceptions about e-bikes related to safety.
So we've been talking about age-friendly communities, we've been talking about transportation, and of course, active transportation is a key component of that. When we started to look or chat with older adults, we started to hear more and more about e-bikes and the electrification of active transportation. So we spoke to older adults in our community and did some qualitative work here and asked them what they thought about the use of e-bikes for active transportation. We did this after we gave them an opportunity to ride an e-bike. And that's really important because prior to having the opportunity to ride an e-bike, most of the older adults we spoke with were kind of rolling their eyes at us, like, oh, I don't need an e-bike, I can ride a bike. So it was really important. Of course, we didn't document that. That's the next research project, I guess. But what was really interesting was once they rode the e-bike, they loved it. They thought there were all sorts of positive aspects regarding safety. They wanted to use it for recreational purposes. They were worried about the weight of the e-bike, but once they rode it, they were totally fine with it. There were definitely, lots of benefits associated with, the idea as they lost fitness or as they got older that they would use the e-bikes. There were some downsides as well. The cost, for example, was limiting. Connectivity and safety within the community were, of course, issues as well. When we talked to the older adults, though, they made some really interesting comments. So, for example, this one raises a bit of an equity issue in my mind. This was a male participant who said, I need something to kind of keep up with the boys without having to fall off the back every time. So I jump on the e-bike and then it's a little more equal. When we get back, we're both exhausted, but it allows me to keep up. And this type of ability to keep up was also identified by women who are riding with their husbands, for example. They want to keep riding, but they can't kind of keep up. So having an e-bike allows them to continue to engage in that recreational activity. As I mentioned, all of the older adults mentioned that as they got older, they see an opportunity to use e-bikes. And then there were also sort of this aspect or intersection with loneliness and social isolation. One person mentioned about a friend that his health situation prevented him from really riding his other bike at all. So the e-bike has given him some sort of a new lease on life, and that's been great. So again, giving people the opportunity to get out of their homes with a form of transportation that's accessible. Of course, the cost was one of the big barriers. So a lot of people find the 4,000 bike price range to be out of their range. So opportunities for subsidies here, I think. We've done some work in the lab as well around e-bikes. So this is just a physiological study where we brought older adults in, did some exercise testing on them, and then had them do 2 laps on the e-bike, or 2 sessions on the e-bike. One where it was unloaded, so just the bike as is, and one where we loaded the bike up with about 20 kilograms to represent groceries, for example. We wanted to see if older adults use the e-bike, use a lot of assistance on the e-bike when they're mimicking sort of active transportation. And what we found actually was that most of the older adults self-selected an exercise intensity that would be considered moderate to vigorous intensity. And this is quite significant because we have an inactivity epidemic as well that's sort of co-occurring right now. And we need to increase physical activity levels, again, for all of the sort of chronic disease prevention reasons, but also for mental health reasons. And so it's great to see here that when you give older adults the opportunity to ride an e-bike for a daily activity, they're still engaging in moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. And so they could replace their sedentary time with this activity, but they could also be gaining significant benefits from using an e-bike. So there's this myth or this perception that when you use an e-bike, you're cheating. And what we've demonstrated quite clearly here is that you're not. You're actually engaging in moderate to vigorous intensity activity. Our most recent work has been a scoping review of e-bike literature, and this was funded through SSHRC and Canada Infrastructure. And what we hope to do with this work was to do a scoping review of the literature available on e-bikes so that we could inform inclusive policies and infrastructure for municipalities. We ended up having a lot more literature than anticipated. So we have about 112 papers that we've included in this review paper, which is currently being prepared for submission. I want to give you some high-level sort of highlights from the work because I think it's relevant to decision makers and certainly folks involved with active transportation. So one of the main issues that we come across both through our consultation prior to conducting the search, as well as through the search itself, is that the definition of e-bikes is creating a significant amount of confusion. For the purposes of our scoping review, we limited the search to pedal assist e-bikes that do not have a throttle. And what we found through this work is that realistically, these pedal assist e-bikes that don't have a throttle should basically be treated the same as a regular bicycle. And I'll give you some support as to why. So when we looked at things like violations, accidents, and injuries, we found, generally speaking, similar outcomes between conventional cyclists and e-bike users. So helmet use, based on the research that we scoured through, was poor, although keep in mind that a lot of the data was from European countries. where there's a lot of active transportation and infrastructure, so helmet use isn't quite common. But importantly, it was poor across both types of bike users, both pedal assist bike users and conventional cyclists. When it came to traffic conflict and violations, they were again similar between the two groups. The most common violation was running red lights, which is problematic, but again, it was similar between the two types of cyclists. And there was conflict with pedestrians, primarily because they're trying to use the same space, because we've got everything but car users trying to crunch to the sides of our roads. So of course, there's going to be some conflict. The risk of injury and accidents was similar when we compare e-bike users to conventional cyclists. And I think this was really important to highlight as well, because again, there's this misconception that using these pedal assist e-bikes is going to increase negative outcomes, which it doesn't seem to be doing. One thing that I thought was really interesting from the studies that actually looked at the speed of e-bike users, almost always the speed was below 20 kilometers per hour. And keep in mind, a lot of this data was from European countries where they have the infrastructure that they probably could even go faster. 20K per hour, to contextualize, I know many people in their introductions mentioned that they're cyclists as well. I mean, when we're riding on the roads, on our road bikes, on the rural roads, we're hitting 60, some people hitting 80, not me. But you know, we're going a lot faster than 20K per hour. So I think that speed is reassuring. And in Canada anyway, 25 is the limit. What was really interesting was that the perception of drivers was really poor when it came to pedal assist e-bike speed. So there were a few simulation studies where they looked at e-bikes coming towards an intersection, for example, and the driver was unable to gauge the speed at which that e-bike was approaching. So I think some real opportunities for education of drivers. And instead of, again, putting all of the onus on the cyclists, we need to put some onus on the drivers here to improve their own sort of knowledge and safety practices. Some of the other things that sort of came out through the literature were, of course, the importance of age, gender, income, and just diversity in general when we're thinking about e-bike related programming. This is a very busy slide, I know, but I wanted to kind of give you a high-level overview of some of the findings as well as the implications in the 6 different areas that we identified literature in. The first being energy and emissions. So there was a clear sort of indication in the literature that there's a significant reduction in emissions, lower energy requirements for pedal assist e-bikes, and importantly, a demonstration that we can create a modal shift when we increase access to e-bikes, so shifting use of personal vehicles. So perhaps the implication here is around shifting subsidies towards e-bikes to really impact greenhouse gas emissions. The bike share program literature was very diverse, I should say. There were a couple of programs in the States, a couple on university campuses, a couple in Europe. The real sort of conclusion I would say from that area is that you really have to take a local context approach, identifying major destinations and figuring out what makes the most sense for your own municipality. But I think one of the other conclusions from that area is that if you build it, they will come. Most of the bike share programs were quite successful and created a modal shift as well. A huge opportunity for first mile, last mile solutions. I've already kind of covered the violations and accidents, so I'll skip that one. I've kind of covered physical activity as well. Again, pedal assist e-bikes without the throttle can be considered physical activity and should be encouraged both for active transportation and recreation. There's a huge opportunity for commuting. I know we're in similar kinds of cities in Oshawa and Barrie where a lot of folks are maybe commuting into Toronto, maybe not anymore, but there are folks that work locally as well. And so creating the infrastructure, again, for some of the major destinations connecting into neighborhoods might be really critical for supporting that modal shift. In terms of perceptions, as I mentioned, once people have an opportunity to use an e-bike, they really do change their perceptions. And I think we have a huge opportunity to increase uptake of e-bikes by providing access to them.
At the end of the presentation, she recommended a few solutions that Barrie can adopt to get citizens' interest in e-bikes.
So in terms of next steps, I think this is where we need to go. We need to create programs, rental share programs where we can allow people the opportunity to try these more expensive bikes and give them a chance to determine whether they're the right fit for them. I think these access types of programs will also affect culture. Even if you're a person who can only drive everywhere, having an opportunity to ride those bikes may improve your own perceptions as well. We definitely need to improve policies. So starting with differentiating between the pedal assist e-bikes and the general sort of broader term e-bikes is going to be important. I know when I talk to my own group or network, when I say e-bikes, they all roll their eyes because they immediately picture those scooters. And that's not what I'm talking about. So some rebranding is required, I think, to ensure that we can, minimize conflict. One of our goals here at the university is to create some sort of an urban mobility consortium as well. We want to have sort of an apolitical, evidence-based group of folks that are coming together regularly to sort of deal with some of these issues. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the work around active transportation hits so many municipal priorities: barrier-free, vision zero, net zero, age-friendly. And so I think we need to start taking a broader integrated approach and really pushing some of this work forward as a solution to multiple problems.
During the question and answer session, Councillor Anne-Marie Kungal asked how to mobilize residents to encourage bike use.
Actually looking at mobilizing residents around a ride and some education. This City of Barrie, through this committee as well, has been looking at how to successfully become a bike-friendly city by designation. We have not been successful in the past, but there is concerted effort. So I know we have also seen through the work that Brett has done and through different aspects, year after year, ongoing extension of bike lanes. I think it was 12 kilometers last year, and we'll have more bike lanes moving forward in this year. Anything through the research that also looks at education or adoption. There was some great qualitative feedback around perceptions of e-bikes too. I think that's really beneficial. And I'm also seeing from a technology around incentivizing e-bikes, there's something called a switch. I'll send it to the committee and to you, Shilpa. But I guess it's upcoming technology that might hit the market soon, and it's around actually just adapting your current bike with a motor, a system. So you're just changing the front wheel. It's not a formal investment in a whole new bike infrastructure. So it'll be interesting to see if that becomes one, more affordable, but also supports adoption. But I know we're moving forward in these steps. We've got Firebird as a local community agency around upcycling bikes, access to bikes, and also I think they've been doing some grant work around repair stations. So I think the city at a level through this committee, I think, is putting some great attention to that. Is there anything where you've seen readiness for adoption? So I sit on the seniors committee. Carolyn's here from the accessibility. We're hoping after today too, we can share the recorded presentation. But is there anything that you think would be a natural kind of step around how to mobilize residents from commentary that you're seeing around comfort level, getting on the bike and getting on the roads?
I think the key opportunity is to create access programs. Like I'm thinking, at the senior center, for example, you could have a few e-bikes that people can try out or take out for a half an hour at a time, give them a try, determine if they like it, if they're comfortable with it, and sort of have these types of bike share programs, but in a safe environment where maybe they can try it in a parking lot because they're not sure what it entails, or maybe they think the weight is going to be too problematic, and so they're nervous about riding the e-bike. So you unfortunately right now, you can't really access an e-bike unless you buy one. And it's hard to invest in something like that until you've had an opportunity to try it. So I think little programs like that will really help. And it sounds like you are committed to sort of the being bike friendly. And so maybe you could even have sort of public, at public events, you could have a couple of e-bikes kicking around that people can try. I'm not sure what the insurance situation is there, but I think that would be a great opportunity because like I said, all the older adults that we had in our study were cyclists. They were recreational riders. So they were quite comfortable on a bike, but had never tried an e-bike, didn't see a need for it. Why would I use this e-bike? And loved it immediately. So if that group can transition to loving an e-bike, then I certainly think there's a lot of opportunity in folks that aren't as comfortable on an e-bike or on a bike in general.
Committee member Eric Van Wissenbach wanted to know how to do a public campaign to get residents excited about the e-bikes.
My comment and my question is, I see part of doing these sort of studies and promoting this sort of transportation as active transportation has to go hand in hand with communication campaigns to the general public to accept cyclists on the road, on the current infrastructure. There isn't a bike lane painted on the road outside my office, but cars need to accept that, or drivers, and everybody needs to accept it. So I see it hand in hand that there has to be communication and public awareness and campaigns to communicate that and bring that understanding in. Opportunities to try a bike helps the driver, if you can get them on a bike, helps someone who's not otherwise biking to understand what it's like to be on a bike. So my question is, in your studies or in your conversations around this topic, have you done any ideas around public campaigns and how that should work hand in hand?
Yeah, there unfortunately hasn't been much around public education types of campaigns, and so I think there's some opportunities there. What I will say from those driver simulation studies, it was quite clear that we need driver training, and so I think that that's going to have to be one of the key recommendations that comes out of this work. The onus can't always be on the cyclist. I mean, it's kind of silly to say, hey, wear an orange vest and you'll be safe. Like that's not the solution. So driver training is absolutely critical. And what that entails, I mean, if you've already had your license, interestingly, the studies showed that the longer a person had been driving, the worse their perception was of the speed of the oncoming e-bike. And so, what do you do then? Do we put in, educational programs? Do we somehow test people if they've had their license for 10 or 15 years? I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to get that type of thing in place, but we definitely need to start to shift the conversation to more driver training and putting some of the onus on drivers. And I think
Councillor Kungal talked about funding for parking enforcement to protect bike lanes. However, Professor Dogra urged caution in involving law enforcement.
Yeah, enforcement's an interesting one in general. Certainly through our consultations, I know communities receive a lot of complaints, especially on some of the multi-use paths and on the roads in general. I think we need to be really careful around enforcement. There's certainly opportunities. So for example, on trails, some of the older adults said it would be nice if there was some presence just to maybe keep things safer. But again, if we're committed to anti-Black racism, we have to be really careful about how we use this enforcement technique. A lot of folks who are riding bikes to get around are low income from racialized communities. And so we don't want to but we have to be very prudent in how we take an enforcement approach as well. So I think, Anne-Marie, that was a great suggestion, like ticketing the cars that are parked in bike lanes, sort of being proactive in that sense. But again, from an enforcement perspective, I think we need to be really careful in how we approach that, because I appreciate the appetite, especially from some of the folks I spoke to here, to get the police out there and just, reduce the conflict and complaints. But we have to think about who's using active transportation in some parts of our community as well, and be a bit careful, I think, around that.
Adoption of e-bikes could help Barrie successfully implement an active transportation strategy. We will continue to bring you updates on this developing story. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.